Well, it was Memorial Day a couple of weeks ago now when this video is coming out, and like every Memorial Day, yeah, I'm one of those schmucks that likes to watch some war movies, and one of the war movies that I tend to like to watch a lot is The Bridge at Remagen. Now, I got curious about the making of this movie because that deserves a video in of itself. On Wikipedia, I noticed that it says something along the lines of this is a highly fictionalized depiction of the battle at Remagen. And having done what is arguably the most in-depth documentary about the Battle of Remagen on YouTube that I am aware of, I can't say that I really agree with that assessment. In fact, I would go as far as to say that The Bridge at Remagen is a historical film done right. Well, that's what this video is about today. We're going to be discussing this movie, the historical inaccuracies, the historical accuracies, and why I truly think that this is a historical film done right. The Bridge at Remagen is a 1969 war film produced by David L. Whopper and directed by King Kong director John Guillermin. I followed both of their careers and I enjoyed them both immensely, and this is by far my favorite movie that either has made. Honestly, this film and Call of Duty Finest Hour were the two things that started my fascination with the year 1945. Not just World War II or anything, very specifically the final year of the war. Very clearly, there are several inaccuracies throughout the entire thing that are rather obvious almost immediately. But you know, I've now had a rather successful documentary released on this. I've even talked to who I believe was Carl Timmerman's granddaughter. Got a lot of information, a lot of rarely seen photos in it, so I kind of, you know, I think I know at least a decent amount about the battle at Remagen. And so I asked myself, does this movie actually hold up as a decent historical movie? So what is The Bridge at Remagen about other than, you know, the bridge at Remagen? Well, it depicts the first 24 hours of the battle at Remagen. Now that there, specifically the 24 hours bit, is key in understanding why the movie focuses on these specific people and not others in the bigger picture of the actual battle itself. This is the decision that the writers and the filmmakers very deliberately made, and I understand it, and I respect it, and I actually like how narrowly focused the movie as a whole is. The character Hartman is clearly based off of Lieutenant Carl Timmerman in all but name. Angel is kind of an imaginative amalgamation of Alexander Drabik, who was the first man to actually cross the Rhine at Remagen, and another sergeant named Joseph Delizio. Even though neither man really fit the characteristics of him, they both kind of serve what Angel does throughout the film in terms of the actual battle itself. Major Barnes is credited on Wikipedia as being inspired by Major Devers. However, knowing the battle itself, to me, Barnes actually fits more with Lieutenant Colonel Engelmann. He is a little bit of Major Devers, and we'll get into why a little bit later. General Schinner, I think that's what his name is. I can't even remember his name being mentioned once in the entire film. He's basically General Hoge and a little bit of General Hodges, who was Hoge's superior. Yeah, isn't that kind of confusing that their names sound so similar? The Germans are also very cut and dry as to who they are, who the movie characters are, and who they're based off of within the actual battle. We have Major Kruger, who's my favorite character of the film, and the best character in the movie by far. Major Kruger is very clearly Major Scheller, who was sent to the bridge at the very last moment. The character Carl Schmidt is very clearly Willy Brodka, who was supposedly in charge of the defenses at Remagen. And then you have Otto Baumann, which is clearly inspired by Karl Friesenhahn, who was the man in charge of the explosives and the engineering portion of the Remagen Bridge. Though the casting on this one is actually quite weird. The guy who plays Carl Schmidt, who's in a lot of these war movies, is an older man, which does fit in line with Willy Brodka. In fact, he even looks a little bit like the real Willy Brodka. Otto Baumann is played by a rather young man, and in reality, Friesenhahn was much older than the actor we see here. In fact, Friesenhahn was a World War I veteran and a loyal Nazi early on. I mean, I think even earlier than 1933, which is actually one reason why it is believed that he was actually spared from quote-unquote the firing squad, was because of his loyalty to the Nazi Party. General Oberst von Brock, according to Wikipedia, is credited as being as being Walter Bosch. This is another one kind of similar to General Schinner as for the Americans, who I think that isn't actually correct. I think Brock actually fits more in line with General Hitzfeld. Hitzfeld was the man who was placed very last second supposedly to be in charge of the Remagen Bridge. Hitzfeld is the man who actually tasked Major Scheller to go check out the Remagen Bridge in the first place, and he's also the man who blatantly abandoned Scheller when the battle is over, and the reason why Scheller was ultimately shot. However, that all being said, Hitzfeld was never arrested like we see what happens to Von Brock in the movie. He was never arrested, nor was he shot like is inferenced in the movie. I have no issues with this. The fact that these aren't their real names, but they're clearly inspired by real people. And I think that's the key in all of this. They were inspired by real people. Now, we also need to take into account when this film was made. This film was released in 1969 and was shot throughout 1967 and 1968. Quite frankly, many of the people were still alive who actually took part of the battle. All of these people, most of these people that are depicted within the film, they're still alive. They're still kicking in 1969. And I bet you this saved the producers a lot of time and a lot of energy, a lot of legal trouble, and a lot of money, quite frankly, to just change their name. And you know what? I think that's a very practical reason why to do that. It was also very common back then for a lot of these movies, i.e. look at Battle of the Bulge, which the cast in the naming of the cast is the least of that movie's problems, but it would have been great if they did something like Tora, 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 or The Longest Day, where they go into excruciating detail of naming the real people at these real specific events. This is one reason why Tora, Tora, Tora is one of my favorite movies of all time, but to me this is a very minor issue. And I know a lot of people, because I talk to a lot of these people, have big problems with movies that do that, and it's never, ever bothered me. There's another thing we'll talk about later that bothers a lot of people for some reason. To me, what counts is the soul of the characters. And do they capture the spirit of who these people were, the essence of who these people were, and specifically the spirit of the battle itself? And in terms of the characters, I say the movie is a resounding yes. Yes, it does capture who these people are, and we'll get into why a little bit later. To me, the biggest inaccuracy of this film, by far, is the opening of the movie. It sets up the entire theme and crux of the film, and it's an inaccuracy. It's a lie for dramaticism. America wasn't racing to find the bridge over the Rhine. We weren't racing to do that. In fact, we were trying to do the opposite. We wanted to actually blow them up. We were blowing them up left and right because we wanted to trap as many Germans on the wrong side of the Rhine as we possibly could. That was the ultimate goal at this specific time in the war that we were trying to do, and the Germans knew it. That's one reason why they were blowing up the bridges themselves as well. Now, the actual invasion across the Rhine and into Germany was actually planned for later that year, and quite frankly, they were just going to use boats to cross the river. That was the entire plan. They'd then use pontoon bridges across the Rhine for heavy vehicles once beachheads were secured and set up. So the entire opening scene, while it is an awesome and really exciting scene, it really does get your blood pumping immediately, is grossly misleading and totally is a lie about the strategic situation the Western Allies found themselves in. The only thing that they do get right is that the Germans were completely on their last legs at this point, and they themselves were racing across the Rhine to try to get as many divisions and as many men over as humanly possible, and civilians as well. Normally, I would kind of graze over this, but it establishes that in the beginning of the movie, but it's contradicted about halfway through the movie. When the Americans actually attack, the movie shows them expecting the bridge to blow up, and they're even making bets as to when it's going to blow up. Now, they clearly are doing this for two reasons. One, they haven't seen an explosion yet, and they know that the Germans had put up detonators on it. But two, they also know that the Americans are going to bombard the bridge, and we see the Americans bombarding the bridge at one point. The tanks all show up, and they just start blasting that bridge. It's awesome and actually relatively accurate, actually very accurate, but that goes completely against what the opening of the movie was suggesting.
Blow you son of a bitch. Oh! Relax. 20 minutes from now ain't gonna be nothing out there but water.
Ironically, the soldiers waiting there is accurate, though. Timmerman and his men were waiting there, and they were placing bets on when the bridge was going to blow up and stuff like that. And, in fact, Timmerman, his first orders when he arrived at Remagen was to start shelling it. It wasn't to try to save the bridge at all. And again, That was to try to trap as many Germans on the wrong side of the river as humanly possible. Destroy that bridge and trap the Germans. And it was a very effective strategy. It was working all across the Western Front. In truth, the Remagen Bridge was forgotten by German High Command, by OKW. It was completely forgotten about. That's why it wasn't blown up. OKW and General Hitzfeld just didn't know it was the last major bridge across the Rhine. In fact, a lot of the generals in High Command at the time thought literally every bridge had blown up at this point. There was total confusion, right, over who was in command of what. Again, my documentary goes into excruciating detail about the confusion of High Command, particularly on the German side, while how organized it was on the American side, all things considered. In Hitzfeld, for example, he was transferred command of that sector at the very last second. He didn't care about it at all. He thought it was diddly squat compared to getting as many of his divisions across the river before the Americans could blow up their stuff. He didn't care about Remagen. It was totally forgotten, and it is truly the apex of the total degradation of the German army come 1945, and the movie does a brilliant job at depicting this. It also does a wonderful job at depicting how tired the Americans were at this time. I mean, they were just nonstop fighting, basically from the Battle of the Bulge. In fact, many of the people here, including Carl Timmerman, were veterans of the battle, and they've been pretty much on the move since that battle. In fact, Timmerman was actually promoted the day before, since his commanding CO was shot. No one else was there, so they gave it to Timmerman. And I'm betting, as we see Hauptmann I bet you he was definitely antsy, because we know that a lot of soldiers come 1945 on the Western Front were really just saying, we just want the war to end. They were just wishing it done, and they were tired. They were exhausted. Many, quite frankly, didn't take the Germans seriously anymore because they knew they'd been beaten. And most of the people that they've been fighting have been old men and young boys, and they've been surrendering by the thousands at this point. I don't think they really took the Germans very seriously here. Their entire mentality, I think, was basically, particularly Timmerman's group, get it over with, get it done. We're done here. Now, the skirmish that we see at about a third of a way through the movie, which takes place the day before the actual battle begins, that is very accurate. In fact, that happened, and it's portrayed very accurately to the actual skirmish that happened. Timmerman, he was a bit reluctant to take command, but he basically had no choice, and that is depicted here with Hauptmann. In fact, he has a great line here, Hauptmann, that I think kind of shows just how tired these men are.
Why the hell don't you admit it? You don't like riding point. I don't like riding point.
In just a couple of words, I think that describes the entire mood that the Americans have on this whole thing. I think it's very brilliant done, and I think it's wonderfully acted, too. Now, when Scheller arrives at Remagen, in reality, it wasn't in a nice car, like we see in this movie. It was actually on a bike. That shows you just how bad it was. That really shows you just how bad it was. In fact, a lot of adjutants and stuff like that for field marshals and generals were having to use bikes and stuff like that because they were just running out of petrol. Now, I absolutely love the montage with Kruger learning about the reality of the situation, and Scheller just slowly realizing the shitstorm that he's just landed himself in. And it's unbelievably accurate what happens in this scene, especially the numbers. What Carl Schmidt is reporting, the numbers that they give are accurate to what actually happened. As far as Hitzfeld knew, and therefore as much as Scheller knew, they had a lot more men there and way better defenses than what was actually there. It was one of those famous examples that happened a lot at the end of the Nazi regime, that divisions that existed on paper actually didn't exist in reality.
That's the road the enemy tanks will have to take. The approach is to the bridge. Are they mine?
There was no artillery position above the hill, which is above the tunnel. Actually, what was there was an experimental rocket weapon, which I'll have a picture of it here, and I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but that's what was positioned up there, and quite frankly, it was quickly abandoned, like the moment the battle began, so it was never fired once during the entire battle. I really also admire the movie for nailing the fail-safes for the detonators. Those are 100% accurate as to what Friesenhahn did at the actual battle, the different checkpoints. I also applaud the movie because I think it expertly shows this, just how tired, weak, young, and old the defenders are. These were people who had never picked up a gun before in their life, had no reason why they would be there. A couple of Polish prisoners were there as well, which is accurately depicted in this movie. Not a fighting force whatsoever, and not what Scheller was expecting. When the battle actually begins, there were several accounts from the Americans that the Germans did actually lay out white flags throughout the town. In fact, the Germans had been doing that a lot. And yet what follows is also done very accurately within the film. Pockets of resistance were throughout the town, and the town kind of formed into a bunch of smaller skirmishes more than it was a giant battle. And some of these pockets of German resistance were actually using the white flags to trick the Americans to get them close, and then firing their Panzerschrecks or lobbing grenades, some Molotov cocktails, I think I read a little bit about as well. And I like that bit. I'm glad that was shown within the movie, especially the scene where the kid shoots at the Americans, and therefore the Americans have no choice but to shoot a kid, and how that affects Angel in particular. The Nazis had so brainwashed all these people that now they've resorted to killing kids. And I really love that scene. Now, this particular incident didn't happen, as far as I know of, at the Battle of Remagen. However, I have read a lot of similar events happening throughout the Western Front at this time. Throughout General Hodges' entire command, his sweep south, which is where this takes place in, I heard there are several cases of this. And it's really sad, and one of the many reasons why I'm just so fascinated about 1945 in general. Now, the scene with the wrong explosives arriving, and that is expertly done. That 100% happened. That scene is 100% accurate to what happened. When the Americans started attacking Remagen, the Germans didn't even have the explosives at all to blow up the bridge, to show just how forgotten it was. And when the explosives arrived, to Friesenhahn's horror, they were the wrong explosives. So not only were they now needing to place them all over the bridge while they're under fire from the Americans, but they are the wrong explosives. And Baumann, that's the character's name, Baumann actually says a great line. He says,
Sergeant, double the amount, crucial point only. Double amount, crucial point only.
I believe that's an actual quote from Karl Friesenhahn during this entire thing. Because if it wasn't a quote, I know he gave the order, because we have records of that order, and we have multiple eyewitnesses of him giving that order. And it's also my favorite part of the movie. I love the editing, I love the atmosphere, I love the loudness of the sound effects. Even if they are dated, I still really enjoy how loud and in your face they are. I love how you can barely hear an officer screaming at one point as the artillery is firing overhead. It's just perfection, in my humble opinion. I just love how the scene plays out. I even love how it looks. I think this movie, there are some parts in this film where I can't believe this movie was made in 1969. Now, speaking of this scene, because this scene is where they really come into play, what we have here standing in for our Shermans are Chaffies once again, similar to the Battle of the Bulge. And while there were Chaffies actually in use within the U.S. Army in particular, during the time of Remagen, none were at the actual battle itself. Instead, what we would have seen, from what I've read, were primarily M4A3 Shermans and a few of the Pershing heavy tanks as well. We know that those were there as well, and a bunch of tank destroyers and stuff like that as well. But that being said, in my humble opinion, I think the Chaffee makes a wonderful stand-in for the Sherman. I know they don't really look alike, but they're quote-unquote light tanks. They're good at sort of selling the overall size. This is something that I hinted at a little bit earlier on here, is that these sort of inaccuracies, Chaffee standing in for Shermans in this case, these hardly ever bother me. I like tanks. Chaffies are tanks. And quite frankly, by 1969, even a lot of World War II tanks, they were kind of hard to come by. One, because we sold a lot of them off and they were blown up in other wars. Two, they were actually blown up during World War II. And three, we were also scrapping a lot of them. They were kind of hard to come by. So the fact that we see Chaffies here, Not an issue. Not an issue. I'm perfectly okay with it. I also like to note that the guns that you see a lot of the Americans use in this film are actually not World War II weapons. They're from the Korean War. Particularly the M1 carbines are what I'm referring to here. And even this I don't really care about. I do get a little peeved when I see particularly those Korean War era M1 carbines, firing on full auto when the M1 carbines of World War II were just semi-auto. I do get a little peeved over that because The Eagle Has Landed does the same thing. But that's sort of like the least of my worries here, because at least they look like the M1 carbines that many of them would have actually had at this time, even though I don't believe anyone under Timmerman's command actually had the M1 carbines. I know Timmerman had a M1 Garand, and I know a lot of people crossing the bridge had M1 Garands, but what immediately gave away that those were M1 carbines from the Korean War era is not the fact that they're firing full auto, it was the fact that they had the curved magazines. At least visually, that is the giveaway for me. Now, General Schinner racing to Remagen and making the order to take the bridge is actually very accurate to what happened. General Hoge did race to Remagen once he got word that the bridge is still standing. He had to see this for himself, and he was the one that made the decision to cross. In reality, Hoge making that decision to cross the Remagen Bridge and to take it was actually a much bigger deal than what is depicted in the movie, because Hoge making that decision was a direct contradiction to the orders he'd received from General Hodges, who in turn got his orders from Bradley, who in turn got his orders from Eisenhower. This was a big contradiction. Now, none of this is in the movie, nor are really the politics behind the upcoming invasion and how several American generals were really pissed at Eisenhower because they thought he was bowing to the British again like he did during Market Garden, Bradley being the most vocal one of these. But at the same time, this goes into what I said at the very beginning of this, where this film is very focused on the first 24 hours of the battle, very focused on a subset group of people. Instead of it being a 10-mile view, it's a 10-foot view. And that's why I don't really care that none of that is in the movie. If this was a bigger scoped movie, and maybe a longer movie, or let's say it was made today and it was a miniseries, yeah, absolutely include all this. This is all dramatic shit that I think would make for good television, or streaming service now, I guess. But to me, it doesn't bother me that it's on this film. It's outside of the scope of it. Now, Hartman meeting with Major Barnes by the bridge is actually based off of an accurate thing. No one hit each other during it, but the conversation pretty much is a little bit more dramatic than what happened, but it did happen. Though it wasn't Angerman. It was a guy named Major Devers, right, who is mentioned on the Wikipedia page. I would have loved to have seen Timmerman's actual quote used here. I do like the one that Hartman says. It's actually a very accurate line, but it's a little bit more dramatic than what happened, and I like just how matter-of-fact the real quote is. Here's the one from the movie.
No, not if we rush it. Cut all the cables. Let them blow it. That's not a bridge. It's a death trap. We are wasting time, Hartman.
And here's what Timmerman actually said. He asked, quote, "What if they blow the bridge up in my face?" Deaver never responds. He just leaves Timmerman hanging there. And I think that's chilling. During the crossing, you actually see Hartman directly taking explosives off the bridge. This is actually accurate as to what Timmerman decided to do when he was crossing the Remagen Bridge. He decided to go under it and to help remove the explosives by hand. And this is seen by several eyewitnesses, one in particular, a John W. Mitchell, and I use this in my documentary. He was an eyewitness of this event, and he described Timmerman cutting the wires. He described it, quote, "While we were running across the bridge, and man, it may have been only 250 yards, but it seemed like 250 miles to us, I spotted this lieutenant standing out there completely exposed to the machine gun fire that was pretty heavy by this time. He was cutting wires and kicking the German demolition charges off the bridge with his feet. Boy, that took plenty of guts. He's the one who saved the bridge and made the whole thing possible." So yeah, what we see Hartman doing is exactly what Timmerman was really doing. So I applaud the movie for this. Now, the biggest inaccuracy of this whole sequence is that the explosions that were detonated by the Germans, that happened actually before Timmerman started crossing the bridge. In the movie, the explosives don't detonate, and so they still needed to be removed. So the Americans are moving onto the bridge before the first set of explosives went off. Now, in reality, that explosion had already happened, and when they found that the bridge was still there, then suddenly the Americans were racing across it to capture it. What is accurate within the sequence is that the Americans didn't know if there were other explosives rigged under the bridge to blow up or not, and it turned out that there was. There were a bunch of explosives that did not go off because of the shoddy wiring of the detonation system that they have, which is accurately shown within the movie. Speaking of stuff that is somewhat outside the scope of this movie, this film makes no mention of First Lieutenant Miller and his Shermans making it across the bridge that night, and the absolute horrors that they went into when they were facing Major Strobel and Major Kraft in their hurried response to try to halt the Americans. That's not in the movie as well. Nor does the movie go into the intense artillery battle that followed the capture of the bridge. As awesome as that would have been, it's outside the scope of this movie. I'm fine that it's not here. It didn't need to be told to tell the specific story that the movie wanted to tell. So Scheller was captured after the battle, and he was blamed for everything unjustly. Hitler ordered him shot, essentially, and, there's a lot of crap there. Scheller's execution reality is much worse than the execution of Kruger within the film. I do love Kruger's final line.
Ours or theirs?
Enemy planes, sir.
But who is the enemy?
Now, that line isn't accurate, There wasn't a final line for Scheller like that, in reality, but it does sum up the entire state of Germany in 1945 very well. And it's also foreshadowed very early on in the movie. Kruger witnesses a bunch of German soldiers being executed by their own men, and so it foreshadowed his own undoing, which, again, from a storyteller point of view, I really like that. In real life, Major Scheller, Major Strobel, and Major Kraft, they were all shot in a ditch in the back of the head in the rain, and then their bodies were looted. They didn't even get a firing squad. They were shot in the back of the head after being blindfolded. Strobel, Kraft, and Scheller, and there's one other guy too, and forgive me, I can't remember his name, and I feel terrible that I can't remember his name. They were also one of the only Germans that I can think of that actually got a memorial placard after the war. There is a memorial placard to them at Remagen, and I can't really think of any more placards commemorating Germans in World War II in Germany. So that's pretty cool, and I think they deserve it. They were they were completely unjustly killed. My final thoughts are, I adore this movie. It's one of my favorite war films. I just think it's an excellent film. The action is good, the acting is phenomenal, the music is okay, not one of Elmer Bernstein's best, but certainly passable. In fact, I think it's arguably the weakest part of this movie. And the cinematography, just like in all John Guillermin movies, fantastic. He really knows how to get his DPs to capture scale. To me, this movie passes the historical rules test with flying colors. It got the big picture. It nailed the big picture. It caught the soul and the essence of the actual battle. So all those changes that the filmmakers and writers ended up making, to me, are completely understandable. And I hope that some of the reasons that I listed will make you agree. And it just didn't take away from the real dramaticism of the battle itself, which I think is another very key element, and I think this movie does a great job at depicting. I'll end here. I'm a sucker for the sound design in this movie, all right? I know that they are dated sound effects. They are old sound effects. You wouldn't hear them used today unless it was kind of the point and kind of the joke. I love them. I love how loud they are. I don't care. I just want to end it on this. There are several scenes in this movie where it's just the sound effects just almost overwhelm you. It's just a beautiful cacophony of sound, and quite frankly, it's exactly what I want in a war movie. I don't need overly dramatic music. I just need a lot of loud explosions, a lot of noise, and a lot of shouting, and that's what this movie does, and it nails, and I appreciate it for that. So I really hope you enjoy. I do kind of want to do more of these style things in the future. You're going to see a lot more film history related stuff on here too, along with my military history stuff. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. You'd be supporting us greatly. Consider becoming an ANP volunteer. The memberships are available on my channel itself. You can see it under memberships, and it's only $1.99 a month. And you have access to exclusive shows and behind the scenes footage, lots of stuff. And all my social media is in the description below. In the end, this is Adam Noyce of AN Productions saying, Sayonara.